In the quiet ice of Antarctica, explorers discover something that could change history. A secret hidden deep under the frozen ground is finally sending out its message. Stay until the end to learn more. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a like and tell us where you're watching from. The wind roared across the endless white view of Antarctica, lifting swirls of snow that danced in the fading light. The rough sea stretched beneath the bottom of a small research boat. Its surface was broken by drifting ice and shadows. Inside the cabin, the hum of the engines was the only sound that stood between the crew and the silence of the world outside. Dr. Emily Carter stood near the viewing window, her gloved hand resting on the cold metal frame. She had seen many storms, many frozen landscapes in her years as an explorer. But there was something different about this one. It wasn't just the cold that bit at her skin. It was the feeling that the world itself was holding its breath. Thomas Hale adjusted a set of instruments near the radar screen, his movements steady and careful. "Pressure's dropping again," he said without looking up. "Another storm's coming in." Across from him, Leah Morris lifted her camera and took a quick shot of the darkening sky through the frosted glass. "Looks almost beautiful," she said softly. Emily gave a small smile, though her mind was somewhere else. Months of collecting information, studying ice samples, and endless cold had worn them all down. The Antarctic did not forgive weakness. Yet beneath its cruel silence, it hid secrets, and that was what kept her here. By late afternoon, the storm began to grow. The wind screamed like a living thing, hitting the boat as the crew locked down equipment and stopped near a slow-moving iceberg. Snow swirled so thickly it turned the world into a white nothing. Leah leaned out briefly from the deck rail to take a photo, then froze. "Emily," she called through the radio, her voice shaking slightly. "There's something out there on the ice." Emily and Thomas rushed to the deck, covering their eyes from the wind. Through the blur of snow, something dark stuck out from the side of the iceberg, a curved shadow half buried in crystal blue ice. It wasn't a rock. It was too smooth, too purposeful in shape. The metallic shine caught a flicker of light from the sun breaking through the storm. "Looks like metal," Emily said, her voice muffled by the wind. "Could be part of a wreck." Thomas squinted. No ship would drift this far south, not in one piece. The storm roared, and for a moment, it felt as though the ice itself groaned beneath them. The three exchanged glances, the silent understanding passing between them. They had to get closer. Against the pull of reason, Emily ordered the small boat to move around the iceberg's edge. The engines whined as the crew fought the wind and current. The object grew larger, blackened, round, and frozen into the heart of the ice. When they finally stopped against the iceberg's surface, Emily stepped out first, her boots sinking into the snow. The air was razor-thin and bitter. She reached out, brushing the frost from the dark metal surface. Beneath her glove, the texture was strange, burned, as if it had passed through fire before meeting the cold. "It's definitely not natural," she said, glancing back at the others. Leah snapped photos quickly while Thomas tapped the surface with a gloved knuckle. It rang hollow. "Could be a probe," Thomas guessed, "maybe one of those early weather models." But even he didn't sound convinced. The sphere was too large, too heavy, too purposeful in construction. Emily leaned closer, tracing her flashlight along a faint ridge in the metal. The shape of writing appeared, nearly erased by decades of ice. She couldn't read it, just the ghost of a symbol, the curve of a letter. "We'll come back for it once the weather clears," she decided. The wind screamed again, forcing them to return to the boat. Behind them, the dark shape remained, half hidden, patient, as though it had been waiting for someone to notice. Inside, Thomas sealed the door and checked their navigation records. "We should mark the location," he said. "If that thing's what I think it is, we'll need proper tools to dig it out." Leah stared at her photographs, zooming in on the image of the object. "It looks burned," she whispered, "like it fell from the sky." Emily said nothing for a long time. She felt the shaking of the storm through the steel beneath her boots, the deep rumbling pulse of something ancient moving beneath the ice. For a quick second, she thought she heard it, a faint metallic echo, like a signal trapped in the wind. She shook the thought away. "We'll return tomorrow," she said quietly. "Whatever it is, it's not just a piece of trash." That night, as the storm raged and the temperature dropped, the crew took turns watching the radar. Outside, The world disappeared into the white emptiness. In her cabin, Emily sat by the dim light of a lamp, writing in her logbook. "The ice is alive," she wrote. "It watches, it remembers." She paused, glancing out the window at the flicker of lightning on the horizon. Somewhere out there, the dark sphere lay buried in silence, a forgotten story waiting to come up. When the wind finally calmed near dawn, Emily closed her notebook and leaned back, tiredness taking over her. She didn't yet know that the shadow in the ice would soon drag her team into the heart of a mystery buried for years. But even now, as sleep took her, the faint hum of the wind against the bottom sounded almost like a heartbeat. The past was calling, and the ice had begun to answer. By morning, the storm had faded, leaving behind a heavy stillness that clung to the frozen landscape. The raw sea lay calm beneath a pale blue sky, the light spread out through mist and pieces of drifting ice. Emily stood on the deck with Thomas and Leah, their breath forming brief clouds in the air as they prepared the equipment. The location from the previous night glowed on the navigation screen, a reminder of what they had seen buried in the ice. It didn't feel like an ordinary day of research. It felt like the beginning of something heavier, something the ice itself wanted them to find. The team loaded drills, heat saws, and ropes into the small workboat. They said little as they approached the iceberg again. The water lapped quietly against the bottom, surprisingly gentle. When they reached the spot, the metallic sphere gleamed faintly beneath a new layer of frost, still half stuck in see-through blue. It looked almost alive, a black heart trapped in glass. Thomas began by setting up the heat drills, his hands steady despite the cold. Steam rose in thin columns as the bit cut through layers of pressed ice. Leah took photos, recording each step with silent care. Emily watched the readings, noting the structure of the surrounding ice and the temperature changes as they cut deeper. Hours passed, and the sound of the drills echoed like distant thunder across the empty space. Sometimes, cracks rippled through the ice, deep and echoing, reminding them how fragile their footing was. "We should slow down," Leah said, her voice low. "The structure is shifting." Thomas ignored her for a moment before finally easing the drill. "We're close," he muttered. "I can feel it." And he was right. As the drill broke through the final layer, the sphere shifted, groaning against the weight of centuries. The sound was deep, metallic, almost sad. Emily motioned for them to stop. Together they brushed away the remaining pieces of ice until the object stood free at last, a burned, scarred sphere about 2 meters wide, its surface marked with strange dents. They gathered around it, breathing hard. Emily ran her gloved fingers over the metal again and froze. The letters were clearer now, faint but clear. Cyrillic, carved in a pattern of numbers and symbols. "Russian," she said quietly. Thomas let out a long breath. That can't be right. There were no Soviet trips this far south. Not back then. Leah stepped closer, camera shaking slightly in her hand. "Maybe it wasn't a trip," she said. Her words hung in the air like a shadow. The ice around the object crackled softly, releasing tiny streams of melted water that traced paths down its sides. The team exchanged uneasy glances. The world around them felt suddenly too quiet. They decided to pull the sphere back to base before the weather changed again. It took nearly the entire afternoon to tie it down using cables, pulleys, and hard work. As they worked, the sound of shifting ice echoed beneath their feet, the sea groaning somewhere deep below. At one point, a crack split open along the edge of the iceberg, and Thomas barely caught Leah as she slipped. The rope snapped tight, her boots dangling inches from the freezing water. Emily helped pull her back, her heart pounding. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The ice was not giving up its secret easily. When they finally pulled the sphere onto the sled platform, the wind began to rise again, whispering through the cracks like a warning. They moved quickly, guiding the snowcat across the frozen ground toward the base. By the time they arrived, the sun had dipped low, turning the world gold and purple. The base stood silent against the view, a group of steel buildings half buried in snow. The crew inside came out to help, amazed at what they saw. "What the hell is that?" one of them asked, but Emily gave no answer. Her eyes stayed on the dark surface of the object as it was lowered into the work bay. The light inside reflected off the burned metal, and for a moment, it seemed to pulse as if reacting to being freed from the ice. The air around it felt charged, a quiet hum that no one could quite explain. Thomas ran starting tests, density, makeup, radiation levels. "It's old," he said finally, staring at the readings. "Really old, but there's still pressure inside." Leah took one last photo before the door sealed. She looked pale, her eyes wide and distant. "Do you ever feel like it didn't want to be found?" she asked softly. Emily didn't answer. She just looked through the small glass window at the blackened surface and felt a weight settle in her chest. The sphere seemed to absorb the light around it, as though holding its own darkness. Outside, the wind began to howl again across the empty plains. Inside, the heaters hummed, and the hum of generators filled the silence. Emily wrote in her notebook late that night, her pen shaking slightly. "The ice released something today, something ancient, something that doesn't belong here." She closed the book and looked through the narrow window toward the storm. The ice had given up its secret, but she could not escape the feeling that the price for finding it had only just begun. The wind had quieted by the time the crew gathered in the work bay. The sphere sat in the center of the room, its blackened surface gleaming under the harsh white lights. Water drops formed around it, a faint mist rising as the frozen metal slowly adjusted to the warmer air. Emily stood beside Thomas and Leah, watching as the rest of the team prepared tools and sensors. The sphere seemed to fill the space as if its presence bent the air around it. "We'll start with the outside study," Thomas said, checking his instruments. "Temperatures stabilizing. No sign of radiation." He paused. "But the readings are strange. The metal's makeup isn't standard steel or titanium. It's a mix I don't recognize." Emily nodded slightly. "Let's keep it sealed until we know more." But even as she said it, her curiosity burned. Whatever was inside had been waiting decades beneath the ice. It was time to listen to what it had to say. They began carefully cutting through the outer shell, using plasma tools. Sparks flew against the dark metal, casting flickering reflections on the bay walls. The sound was deep and echoing, ringing like a distant bell. Leah flinched as the first section of the shell gave way with a hollow groan. A rush of pressurized air escaped, carrying with it a faint metallic smell. The odor of old machinery and something else. Something almost human, like smoke and dust. Thomas switched off the torch and leaned closer. "It's hollow," he said quietly. "There's another layer inside." Emily signaled for him to continue. Bit by bit, they cut through the second wall until the round door loosened and fell inward with a dull clang. For a moment, none of them moved. The air that poured out was stale, ancient, heavy with time. Inside, the flashlight beams caught rows of metallic tubes strapped in place. Leah stepped forward, her hands trembling as she brushed off the frost from one of the containers. "Film," she whispered. "Old photograph reels." Emily's eyes widened. "Get them to the darkroom now." The team moved quickly, moving the fragile containers with careful precision. Each one was sealed, stamped with faded markings, and numbered in Cyrillic. The room buzzed with quiet rush as the scientists and helpers worked side by side. In the dark room, the faint red light covered everything in shadow. Emily and Leah put on gloves and masks, their hands steady as they unrolled the film into the developing trays. The chemical smell filled the air, sharp and nostalgic, and slowly the images began to appear. At first, there were only blurred outlines, cloud formations, coastlines, patches of sea. But then as the film developed further, the truth came into focus. The photographs showed views from above, clear, exact, impossibly detailed of military complexes, shipyards, and air bases, American ones. The silence in the dark room deepened. Leah stepped back, her voice barely heard. "This can't be real." Emily stared at the images. She knew exactly what they were looking at. "Spying," she murmured. "These are spy photographs." Thomas joined them, flipping through each reel with growing disbelief. "This technology, these shots are too advanced for anything from the early 60s. He turned toward Emily. That thing wasn't just a satellite. It was surveillance. Soviet intelligence. The realization settled like frost in the room. They had found a piece of history lost to war and secrecy. Emily felt both wonder and dread wash over her. "So it fell," she said quietly. "It stopped working in space, crashed here, and no one ever found it." Leah's voice cracked. "Until now." The next few hours passed in a blur of studying and guessing. They recorded every detail, every frame, storing them digitally and sealing the originals. Each image carried pieces of a story buried for 60 years. As they projected the film onto the lab screen, the faces of men, ships, and cities lost to time flickered across the wall. It felt like watching ghosts move across the surface of history. "Do you realize what this means?" Thomas asked. This could close an unsolved intelligence leak from the Cold War. The Americans lost secret information back then. No one ever figured out how. Maybe this was it. Emily said nothing. She was staring at one particular photograph, a coastline familiar in shape, lined with rows of military hangars. It was taken from high above, the shadows crisp and perfect. She imagined the satellite tumbling from space, its mission incomplete, carrying the weight of two nations' fear. Now, after decades of silence, it had spoken again. Leah turned off the projector, dropping the room into darkness, except for the red emergency light. "What do we do now?" she asked. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. "We record it. Every image, every marking, and then we send it to the proper authorities." She paused, then added, "But we'll keep copies. The world deserves to know." Outside, the wind began to rise once more, brushing against the walls like a restless spirit. The ice had given up its secret, and with it, a piece of forgotten history. For the first time since arriving, Emily felt the weight of something larger than science. A connection to the lives that built and lost this machine, to the fears that once defined an era. As she left the lab, she looked back one last time at the film reels drying in their trays. The images seemed to breathe in the dim light, as if aware of being seen again after so long. And deep within her, she knew that whatever peace the ice once kept had been disturbed forever. The storm had passed by the next morning, leaving behind a sky so clear it seemed fragile. The ice fields shimmered under the pale light, and the air was still enough to hear the faint creak of shifting glaciers. Inside the base, the team gathered in silence. The dark sphere now sat locked inside a holding unit, its discovery already reported to the International Research Council. Emily stood by the window of the communications room, staring out at the horizon where the sky met the ice in a perfect line. The events of the last 48 hours replayed in her mind like pieces of a dream. The sphere, the photographs, the realization that history had been sleeping beneath their feet for decades. Yet, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a burden finally dug up. Leah entered quietly, holding her camera against her chest. "The authorities are sending a transport team," she said. "They'll take the capsule to the mainland by tomorrow." Emily nodded. "Good. It doesn't belong here anymore." Her voice was calm, but her eyes showed tiredness. The night before, she had hardly slept, her thoughts filled with the images from the recovered film. The shadows of ships, the geometry of airfields, the echoes of a world driven by fear. Thomas joined them, carrying a clipboard with final readings. "Pressure levels inside the capsule are stable. Whatever systems were in there, they died a long time ago." He hesitated. "You know, I've seen a lot of machines, but this one, it's different. It feels like it's still listening." Emily gave him a small, tired smile. "Maybe it is." She turned back to the window. Outside, the wind lifted small swirls of snow that rose and disappeared. For a long moment, no one spoke. The base was filled with a kind of respectful quiet, as though the ice itself was watching. In the common room, a small radio hummed with static before catching a distant frequency. An old song played, its melody soft and haunting. Leah glanced at it, and then at Emily. "Strange timing," she said. Emily didn't reply. She walked down the hallway to the work bay one last time. The capsule sat still, but its surface had lost its chill. The frost had melted completely, revealing every scar and burn mark from its fall through the atmosphere. Emily approached it slowly, placing her gloved hand against the metal. It was warmer than before, almost as if the ice had released not just an object, but something alive, a memory perhaps, or a confession. She remembered the film reels, the silence of the projection room, the faces of her team as history unfolded in front of them. "You waited long enough," she whispered. "Now the world will finally hear you." She stayed there for a moment, feeling an unexplainable calm. Behind her, Leah entered quietly and lifted her camera. She took a single photograph, Emily and the dark sphere, framed by the soft light filtering through the frosted glass. It was the last image captured in that base before the capsule's departure. When the transport arrived the next day, the horizon was painted gold and purple by the low sun. The capsule was loaded onto a heavy transport sled, its surface covered in protective sheets. The team stood together outside the base, watching as the snowcat began its slow journey across the plain. No one spoke. The engine's low hum faded until it was swallowed by the wind. Thomas was the first to turn back toward the base. "You think they'll keep it secret?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "Secrets don't last forever. Not even under ice." Leah smiled faintly. "Maybe that's a good thing." They walked in silence, their footsteps muffled by the snow. That evening, Emily sat alone in her quarters, writing the final entry in her log book. The ice remembers everything. The wind carries whispers of what was lost. Today, the past left our hands, but I think a part of it will always stay here with us. She paused, then added one last line. "Sometimes the past doesn't die. It just waits for someone to bring it home." She closed the notebook and placed it on the small metal desk. Outside, the sky had turned to a deep dark blue. The first stars appeared, faint and cold. The Antarctic night stretched endless and silent. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt peace. Leah joined her on the viewing deck a little later. They stood side by side, watching the aurora shimmer faintly in the distance. The wind brushed their faces like a sigh. "Do you ever wonder how many stories are buried out there?" Leah asked quietly. Emily nodded. "More than we can ever find. But maybe that's how it should be." The lights in the sky flickered, green and gold, reflecting across the endless ice. Somewhere far away, the transport continued its journey north, carrying the capsule and the ghosts of an old war back to the world that created them. For a long time, neither woman spoke. Then Emily whispered almost to herself, "It's over." The wind answered softly, carrying her words into the night until they vanished into the vast, frozen silence of Antarctica. The mystery found beneath the ice is only the beginning. Who knows what else Antarctica still hides? Comment where you're watching from. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. More unforgettable stories are on the way.